Good afternoon. Thank you for your patience and a very, very warm welcome to our conversation program. My name is Colleen Milliard. I'm the executive editor here at Art Basel. And I'm really delighted to be hosting this discussion between two artists, Ellen Gallagher and Michael Armitage, and the writer and videographer Manthia Diawara. This conversation is part of our ongoing series of artist influencers, which has been conceived and is hosted by the one and only Hans Ulrich Obrist. So I just want really to thank you all for being here. This feels like a very special panel. You've traveled from far. So thank you. Also, really encourage you all to go and see Michael's extraordinary exhibition at the Kunsthalle Basel. And I want to thank my colleagues at Kunsthalle Basel for the help in putting this together. So just to kind of a little bit of housekeeping so you understand how it's going to work. The conversation will last about 15 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to questions. And before I hand over to Hans, please join me in giving them all a very, very warm welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colleen, and all my thanks to Mark Spiegel, to Colleen, to Emily, to Ariane. I also want to say very special thanks to Adele Köchlin for the research, and of course, as Colleen said, to the Kunsthalle, to Elena Filipovic, and the teams of the Kunsthalle Basel. And for those who haven't seen it, it's really urgent to go and see Michael's exhibition. And I also wanted to say that it's actually, rumor says that it's Elena Filipovic's birthday, so a very happy birthday to Elena Filipovic. And I'm incredibly grateful to Ellen, to Michael, and Manthia for accepting the invitation to speak here. Ellen Gallagher is a painter and filmmaker who lives in Rotterdam and Brooklyn and builds intricate multi-layered works that pivot between the natural world, mythology, and history, often also connected to archaeology. There is a show right now in Spain, in Santander, at the Botín Museum with Edgar Kleine collaborations of a law, a blueprint, and it's three words, no? A law, a blueprint. The book should say it. A law?
It says it on the cover.
A scale.
A scale.
A scale, yeah.
It's a quote from Sun Ra.
A law, a blueprint, a scale, and of course Ellen has had exhibitions in many museums, the Tate, the Whitney Museum, but has also done many, many books. The biggest book certainly is it's 5 books with a magnet. I think it's almost 1,000 pages. Michael Armitage lives and works between London and Nairobi, and as mentioned, has the exhibition here at the Kunsthalle, got his BA final from the Slade School, and has a postgraduate from the Royal Academy, where, of course, his exhibition took place last year. In September 2020, he opened a solo show at the Haus der Kunst in Munich. That's the show which then went to the Royal Academy. We collaborated with Patrizia Sarratore Baudengo and the foundation, and actually also Isabella Mora, who produced it on a show at the Accademia in Madrid, which connected Goya, Michael Armitage, and Sembene. We're going to talk about that later. And that brings us to Manthia Diawara, who wrote actually the catalog text for both Ellen's and Edgar's show in Santander, and also for Michael's show in Madrid. Manthia holds the title of University Professor in Arts and Sciences at New York University. He's Professor of Comparative Literature and Film. He's the author of many books on cinema and art. His films include An Opera of the World, which premiered at Documenta 13, the new Baroque of Voices, that's very recent, at the Sao Paulo Biennial, and of course, Edouard Glissant, One World in Relation from 2009. And I wanted to explain quickly how this panel came about, because as you know from the formula, it's usually 2 artists in terms of kind of mutual inspiration. But today is a very special field, we can say, of many different inspirations. You will see later that all roads somehow lead to Edouard Glissant. But we're also going to talk about Goya, which I think connects the three of you deeply. We're going to also talk about Octavia Butler. We're going to talk about many different things, connections between art and literature. And the panel was really born when we were in Madrid with Manthia and Michael actually working on this panel there at the Academia. And and Manthia showed us the text, the amazing text he wrote for Ellen. And we sort of realized how many connections are. Michael said how inspired he always was by Ellen's work. So we thought it would be wonderful here for the first time to kind of bring three artists together and talk about these many different, mutual inspirations. And I also wanted to say how it actually all began with our first encounter with Manthia. It was at the 80th anniversary of Edouard Glissant in a jazz club in Paris that Edouard brought us together and actually felt that it would be urgent that we collaborate. And it's, of course, very, very fascinating how Glissant plays a very crucial role in both texts you wrote actually for Ellen and for Michael. So please join me in giving Ellen, Michael, and Manthia a very warm welcome.
Thank you.
And I thought, sort of to begin, and before we look also at the presentation, that it would be kind of great to hear a little bit how you met each other, and just maybe to hear first from Manthia about your long dialogue with Ellen and your more recent dialogue with Michael.
Thank you, Hans Ulrich, and I'm delighted to be here. Oh, Ellen, we used to hang out in the 90s in New York, in Greenwich Village. I'm a professor at New York University. And I think one moment that I always treasure, she has different stories, but one time she sent me this, I think it was a birthday present. And it's got little, very tiny black faces on it, like cowrie shells, that kind of remind you of all the conversations on black stereotypes and how moving stereotypes cannot be fixed, and how you shouldn't be fighting them, because when you fight them, that's when they actually capture you. So we would go places, New York, music, literature. NYU was very vibrant in the 90s. I'm not saying to NYU people you're no longer vibrant, but it was a great moment. And with Ellen, what was special to me was, Glissant says this a lot. David Hammond says this a lot. She's interested in the work when it is in process, before it is finished. How little things, today you were saying the little holes, this and that. How
in Michael's work.
Yeah. How they come to life. That really was very fascinating to me, coming from literature where we're looking at finished works. But the work when it's in process is really when it provokes you. So that, so I followed her forever. She just, her work teaches me a lot, and we'll have plenty of time to talk about that today. Michael blew me away, first with his series on color, a film by Sam Ben Usman, film 1974. This is a film that's already is disillusioned about African independences. It's a film that is already saying decolonization was fine, but what do we do now? And Sam Ben goes as far as saying, now Africans, I hope that you know Sam Ben Usman. So when I say this, you don't get shocked, because he says the same thing about the West too. He said, now, after colonialism, after slavery, Africans are killing more Africans than white people did. Of course, he's as hard on white people, if you know Sam Ben Usman and his films. So when Michael worked on Sam Ben, and then I began to look at the Kenyan election in his work, I wrote to Hans Ulrich right away. I said, wow, this guy is bad. Because he began to make you think about things that you just see in the newspaper and you dismiss. But then you see it in the painting. 3,000 people die in some Kenyan elections, just for who's going to be in power. So, I mean, we see the same thing today all over the world. But to focus on to tell the truth about yourself, I think that's really what attracted me to his work. Young generation, people keep telling us, after the artists of the independence movement, the first African modernist, that today's generation, they do not have a discourse. And then I saw a discourse in these two people. There is a discourse that goes through The Abyss by Edouard Glissant, that goes to Opacity, that also really is now going from your location, but thinking with the world, not just surrounding yourself within walls and saying that my problem is the biggest problem, but telling you can actually not only change your world, but it can change the world. It's that totality that attracted me to their works. And I'm really happy to have known them and to actually call them my friends now.
Thank you, Manthia. Maybe, Ellen, we can hear from you about your dialogue with Manthia, which goes back to the 90s.
It does. You know, when I came to New York, I was, I think, really an outsider there. You know, I came in from New England, and at that time, it was really, you had to be in New York. And now I think it's more spread. People know you need to, but it was a different time. And Manthia was one of the people that really greeted me and let me know that I was, you know, what you said about our work having a discourse, you immediately let me know I was part of that.
Right.
And that it wasn't just American, that what I had access to. And I don't even know you didn't know my background, that I think you didn't know yet, that I had traveled to Martinique and I had these other experiences. Yeah. But maybe, you know, you remember I was going to Mali for the first time.
That's right.
And we were
talking... You talk about that train ride.
Yes.
And the moon.
Yeah, and the moon. Yeah,
Yes.
I'm a bit of a romantic.
Yeah,
but no, it was that we were sleeping on buses at night because we had no money.
Right.
So instead of getting a hotel, we would sleep on the buses. Really... And the red dust would come in and you know, you would be covered in... But I just remember that I made the decision to do this with two women friends. We went together, and it was a big deal to do. And it was right before my first, you know, exhibition with Gagosian. And so I was also, you know, trying to find a way to be linked in New York and in an international way that wasn't set out for me somehow, you know? And you really made me feel like, of course you're going to Mali while you're making this work. And I remember you were the first person through the door at the opening, you know, to say, you know, I feel you've been, you know, and that we would talk about it more. Yeah.
And Michael, maybe we can hear from you about the Madrid meeting, your first meeting with Manthia, how the dialogue began.
Yeah, the first meeting of sorts was watching your film that you made with Ngugi wa Thiong'o.
Oh, yeah.
Who's another, equally legendary figure to Manthia as well, on Sambene. And, you know, Sambene had been someone that has affected me and influenced me massively in my thinking of how I wanted to, and what I wanted to look at in my work. And it's actually, I found it quite difficult to find interviews with him in English, you know, and access to that. And then I was just totally blown away by the film that you made. And then, you know, again, like, very humbled to be able to sit and talk to you and talk with you and, you know, begin a friendship like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And it's great that this panel, you know, starts in a way with Sembene, because when I curated at the Dakar Biennial 15 years ago, we went to see Sembene in his office, and it's kind of incredible how this filmmaker, who really is one of the most important filmmakers of the 20th century, is of course known, but not known enough. And it's fascinating how the three of you also deeply connect to that work. And it really was so fascinating, Michael, when we worked on the project for for Madrid, the idea kind of was that it would be a connection between you and Goya, because the Academia has all these Goya etchings. It's the place where the etchings began, and has also got many paintings by Goya, and we wanted to make this encounter, in a way, between you and Goya. And then we were in the studio, and we looked. Michael's studio has kind of 2 rooms. There is a big room, and you didn't show me the small room on the first studio visit. It was only the second time that we went to the smaller room, and it's a tiny room full of hundreds of drawings, like sketches and drawings. And then all of a sudden, you talked about Sembene. There was a whole group of drawings there about Sembene, and for you, it's the film Xala, I think. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think you know, there's something in what Manthia was saying already that I feel is very much in Goya. And if you look at just at the disasters of war, I say just, it's enough. It's exactly how you described Sembene, looking at both ways.
Exactly.
You know, everyone is put on the same stage, and for me, that's always done with. However horrific the scenes are depicted, it's done with a respect for empathy and wanting to encourage people to maybe live together in a better way. And there's a huge amount of love for me in Goya's work. And the same again I feel in Sembene, where they also deal and look for a sense of identity, like a visual identity, and take on different kind of elements of culture, whether it's more mystical elements or more socio-political elements. I found there's a phenomenal amount of parallels between how they work. And then in that film in particular, as in many of his films, there are so many painting references that run throughout it. And, you know, there's also a brutal sense of humor as well that's in there. None of them used anything without it, like, you know, being very direct and hard-hitting. And again, sitting back and looking, for example, at a scene in Kala where the daughter comes to her father, you know, and there's everything in the room is there for a reason. There's one behind the father who's the political figure, is a map that's a Western map. Behind the daughter, who speaks in her mother tongue, is a hand-drawn map of the continent, you know, down to the color. Like everything in all of his scenes is so. You don't see it, but it's all there to, you know, subvert everything that you're taking in. And I found that being like a very similar sort of sensibility, really, and totally different, but yeah.
And actually, when we had this conversation, Manthia immediately said, Ellen has such an incredible connection to Sembene. So it would be great to hear from you about, is it the same film? Is it also Xala?
No,
it's a different film. That's why it's interesting.
It's different. Well, first, of course, there were the films that were Camp at Tioroy. Yeah, but then actually through Manthia, I think you didn't know this, that I was looking for your interviews, and this interview where you are in Burkina Faso.
Yes.
And I don't know, you seem to have brought him together with John Singleton, who did Boys in the Hood. So this was around 1994.
Yeah.
And that was a big deal, you know, that film coming out, and then to bring him to Sembene and that sense of continuum again that you shared with me, that you, of course, are doing again. And from that interview, I discovered Black Girl and also The Wagoneer, Borum Sarat.
That's it, yeah.
Yeah, so that's black and white film made before Black Girl, 1963. And he's made, he was studying in Russia, Sembene, yeah, and then he makes this film. But Black Girl really struck me because it opens with, I guess the filmmaker was really indignant about actually having been on the coast of France and at a beach resort and reading in the paper just Le Noir de, and that was her obituary. She didn't have a name, Duana. Her name wasn't mentioned, her family wasn't mentioned. It's just that she died, Le Noir d'eux, and that then is translated into The Black Girl. And it's just an incredible film because on the one hand, it is really painterly. She comes, when she meets this family, she's in Senegal still, and she works as, she takes work as a housekeeper, and then they are going to go back to France and she will join them. But you already have this premonition, I mean, she dances on the monument to the both World War I, the war veterans for France from Africa and from Senegal, from the colonies that died and that span World War I and World War II. Yes. And she's a bit oblivious, and it's this post-independence moment, and she dances. And then she goes to be, she's an ingenue, right? She's in her beautiful polka-dotted dress, and she's, she's a traveler. She's a young person traveling in the world. But now the way the family reads her, and it's really this, these manners, it's all very polite and but, he doesn't open the door for her to get into the car, when he comes to pick her up. Now that she's, she's in France, and she has to carry her own bag into, and it was just a sign that how brutal this would be, but within this very mannered system, that she suddenly was going to become captive in his lack of sight, or the family's lack of sight. And luckily she travels with this mask that she's bought. Yeah. And so that mask, she ends up committing suicide. And the only mention of her suicide while she's trapped in this horrible situation with his family is Le Noir d'eux, the person who belongs to these other people. Black girl is the translation. But I love that the filmmaker actually, he says he really found that from a newspaper article. Right. And I love the idea of pulling from the news of the day to make your art, no matter how.
Thank you so much. And actually, there couldn't be a better segue now to the images, because we said we would do a prelude, a part one, and we wanted to address the importance of Ousmane Sembene for all your practices. And we'd now like to start with the images, and maybe we can start with Ellen. And I think it makes a lot of sense now that we discussed film to actually maybe rather begin with the filmic work and then talk about the painting. And Manthia, you said you might make the segue into Highway Gothic, which is an installation which is actually, it's featured in your current show in Santander at the Botti Museum. It's an installation consisting of film projections, but also banners. And
Cyanotype.
It's exploring the ecological, culture, and also social impact of the US Interstate 10. So Manthia, would you segue maybe a first question
I
to Ellen?
What is interesting to me, what just has been said, Michael talks about that image in color where you have the map of Africa in the background, and then you have, I think, at least one of the African, like Lumumba, somebody else pictured there. And then the father says, my daughter, what is it whenever I speak to you in Wolof, the main Senegalese language, you respond, no, I speak to you in French, you respond to me in Wolof. And the daughter just dismissed it. And then the image question came up in your talk also when you said that at the end of Black Girl, this is Sembene's main issue, because he was a well-known novelist taught by the Communist Party in Marseille, wrote about 6 novels before becoming a filmmaker. So because he went to Africa, traveled from Senegal to the Congo, no one knew him because people were now reading novels. So he said, I need to speak to people. And it was the image and the sound, basically. That's one reason why he went to film, to speak to people in African languages, but also to show them images, to give them voices, basically. Because Black Girl is about being mute, but at the same time, trying to find your voice, trying to speak. It's very important in the film. I think Highway Gothic and most of Helen's work, all the way to the black painting, what gets me really, of course, we talk about Glissant, we talk about Goya, but this way of being at the avant-garde of what is very popular today in the US in terms of Afrofuturism, in terms of the return of the repressed, in terms of Afro-pessimism. These are languages that are very important, and she's been working with this. And whoever one is talking about Osadex, the highway Gothic, she is always breaking what in film school we call, or in theater, breaking the fourth wall. That is the wall, the frame here is like the audience joining the image. She's always bringing you into the image. That's really what I thought was very powerful in the kind of work that she is doing. But you're in a better position to tell us about Highway Gothic.
Well, actually, Michael and I met at the initiation of this project. We both were invited to New Orleans to be part of this triennial. And it's a grief triennial, you know, to commemorate Hurricane Katrina. Yeah. So that's very kind of specific, like Gwangju, you know, it's very specific kind of space to enter. And I knew I was already experimenting with cyanotype, and I was really interested in, you know, that cyanotype had been used to make blueprints, to fix. So you would use cyanotype to make these blueprints because it's an emulsion, it's sealed in, so nobody could mess with your design. So you knew that was the final building plan. But from the blueprint, an English Victorian botanist, now I'm just completely, Anna Atkins, started turning that into cameraless photography and making specimen prints of seaweed that she found along the coast. And so she basically made the first photographic book from these specimen prints. And I was really interested in both the physicality of the film, that it was really marked by this process, the cyanotype process. You know, it really, it's an emulsion, but it really changes the matter itself. So it's not just the blue hue, it's actually in there and kind of sculpting the material. And I knew I wanted to do that, but I was thinking that maybe we would go to follow the I-10 out to the swamp, and we would make, again, being so process-based, we would use the swamp to process the film. That maybe we wouldn't make a narrative, and it would just be the swamp itself. But instead, we were so struck by this I-10 and the way, and the parallels, you know, the way it cut through both Claiborne Avenue, the Treme neighborhood, and all the way out to the swamp, to the wetlands. We wanted to travel it through there, and we realized we needed to actually cyanotype what was in the swamp, and we needed to film around the swamp. So we really wanted to follow that I-10 and make this parallel between the film, you know, because it's so often, I mean, this also happened to the neighborhood I grew up in. So there's this highway I-10. You have I-95 through the East Coast, through Rhode Island and Connecticut and New England. And so designed by Robert Moses. And already in 1946, the mayor of New Orleans was talking to Robert Moses to get this sort of federal project money to help the city to design a highway through the Old Quarter, through the French Quarter, which of course they fought. So instead, quietly, by the 60s, the federal highway project, they started buying up, using eminent domain, land in Treme, in the black neighborhood. And so thus you have this waterway. And during Katrina, you know, you remember all those images, all the water and also all the animals came through New Orleans over this interstate. So it was really a carrier across. But it also completely decimated Treme. So before I-10 goes up, you know, at the turn of the century, in the 1900s, you have more than 300 black-owned businesses. And then after it goes up, it's immediately down to like 30. So it was really destroyed. And it became, you know, in what had been a site of Mardi Gras, this oak-lined boulevard, and also mourning, you know, first-line mourning and second-line mourning and celebrations now became, you know, what had been a commons became an enclosed space. And so it was really important for us to, knowing that history, and then to trace that back to the swamp. And of course, as you know, a black woman being in a swamp is not the first thing I wanted to do. But for Edgar, that was really important, that we had to spend time in the swamp and we had to make a kind of community in the swamp. Yeah. He wanted even a larger group of us. You know, we, in the end, could only convince one person, our actor, our lead point of view, Andre, to come, and he was a dancer and a very generous person, to come and stay with us on this houseboat. And it was this combination of terror and also magic, frankly, because it is an incredible wetlands. It's you know, enormous in the Gulf of Mexico, but it's also a really scary place. I mean, the history of swamps and as a control places where, you know, in terms of people being lynched and you know, I mean, it's just a very scary place to be. And also on the side of a highway. I mean, Highway Gothic is actually the name of the piece, but it's also the name of the signage to move. It's a readable language to move through. So this is the installation. So even though we initiated the project in New Orleans, where you had your paintings also on display, we didn't really get to this point, and this was at Wheels, where we really finally, we met again at Wheels as well, where that fourth wall you talk about, where it really became this immersive. So there were two projections, but in a way many projections, because the banners are translucent and the light moves through them. Yeah. And yeah, so there's that, and this was, you know, on Claiborne Avenue, so a house that's been sort of left by itself to, and this sign for the taxman, because in a sense that's what ended up happening, is that the neighborhood got so destroyed that, you know, the supermarkets, everybody moved to the suburbs, and that actually the black community, not only their own culture, you know, that was thriving, took a hit. They also then had to shop elsewhere and subsidize what was being done to them. So it was, you know. But what was interesting to me was to actually reclaim that sense of play for us in the swamp, and so to actually create something there together, you know, and that was something we really realized that the people had done in Treme, had actually turned this you know, this concrete centipede into an acoustic device. So now it was, we originally thought we wanted to hang the banners under the highway, but we realized we couldn't because it's a really important site now, acoustically. For Mardi Gras, people use it to bounce sound off. And it's also really important for Mother's Day for some reason. So it's both this, you know, this thing that really cut everyone off, and it's complete science fiction, you know, and it's this erasure of memory, and it's this erasure of culture, but it's again something that, you know, can somehow be not restituted for sure, because it's there, it's not going anywhere, but it can somehow be reclaimed, you know, sort of what you said earlier about the black painting. So now I only have one black painting.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that, because it's fascinating in the text. In this amazing book from Santander, there is Manthia's essay, and Manthia, you talk about this idea actually of the film we've just seen, the installation, being about stories of becoming, and in a way that's also true for this series. It's the stories of becoming. It's something coming to life, and it's actually a series you started in more or less when we met, more than 20 years ago, around 1998, and you've been doing for many, many years. It's an impenetrable, often glimmering black surface, and as you said in interviews, is reminiscent of crude oil, pointing at the brutal realities of colonial extraction. And Manthia writes in an amazing way in the catalogue about this work, sort of saying that it's also about the search for unconditional freedoms. Manthia connects it actually to David Hammond's body prints. The idea that freedom is achieved through the body. You make that link. And also, in a way, the right to opacity is a very important aspect. He brings it to Edouard Glissant and his sort of emphasis on the right of opacity. So I wanted to ask you to tell us maybe more about it. And it's always so fascinating with such a seminal series, how it began.
Yeah.
How was the beginning? How did it start?
I wanted to make, really something. I wanted to make something large and black and still inscrutable, and at the same time, it was, so it's impossible to see in this slide, but they're about 10 feet by 8 feet generally. Some are bigger, and it's hand cut from sheets of rubber. So all the bits that look like they might be white, they're really just reflecting light. So there's a kind of paper grid, and then there's all this like a labor that actually overwhelms me. And I think that was the David Hammond's reference, that using your body so completely in the work that it could actually overwhelm. Like in that sense, the process and the conceptual idea are really bound together. And building with these cut bits of rubber. And so the whole thing is incredibly built and really structured in this way that is really not very painterly in a way, until at the last moment there is in a layer of enamel that's either airbrushed on or poured on, and then it really throws everything into bas relief suddenly. Everything that is above the surface, including even the grid of the penmanship paper, but especially the small rubber hand-cut bits, they then like reflect light. And that becomes this moment where the whole painting goes liquid. So it becomes something then. And in that way, I think even before I was making the projections, it is a kind of projection in that sense, that it needs that moment to be thrown into.
And Manthia, you write about the trembling. And that's a very Glissantian notion, the tremblement. Edouard often told us about the idea of the tremblement, and you talk about the black paintings also in relation to tremble with those lost at the bottom of the abyss. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I love the beautiful way that Ellen talked about this, from the highway Gothic to the black painting. What is important in Glissant that ties to this is this idea of becoming. Becoming, it, for lack of better translation, it's just, for those of you who speak French, it's être étant. Verb être, étant, which is continuous, whereas to be is to be fixed. And Glissant's whole life, he was against any kind of fixity, anything that, identities that are just fixed. He was against this, this and that. So étant became very important to Glissant, and he applied that as a metaphor to black life, as opposed to returning, let's say, after slavery, you return to Africa, or after a long immigration, you return to Europe. You are always becoming. You make, and the word that both Glissant and Deleuze use is detour. And detours are always contaminated. So that's what I like about this. So it's no longer memory where you can remember specifically and bring pieces together, but you're working with traces. And then when you put those traces together or those dots together, then suddenly something fearful light begin to enter into things. And that's really what's very, very important to me. And when that life comes, Glissant was very, he first said everything has to be poetic. When you do science, science has to be poetic. You do economics, it has to be poetic. Poetic. And if you do philosophy, philosophy has to be poetic. But if it's just it's transparent, it's rational, it's logical, 1, 2, 3, 1 + 1. Glissant is not interested in. So Glissant is saying, you have to be able to tremble with the trembling of the other. And in order to tremble with the trembling of the other, you can't come with certainty. You can't say, oh yeah, Manthia, I know you, you're from Mali. They were colonized by French people, right? And you speak this language, right? Therefore, I know you, I own you. This kills Glissant. Glissant said, no, you don't know a person, even your own brother, your own sister. You have to meet the person and get to know the person and tremble with the trembling with the other person. This was very important to Glissant. And when there is no trembling, Glissant is saying there is no life really. And this is all the more important for art. You know, for art, if the art doesn't make us tremble, the process that Ellen just mentioned too, if the art doesn't bring us there, then we really are getting all the knowledge that we learn, I don't know, from the Renaissance to the present, and then we show our mastery and we present it to the people. You need to show me something that is opaque, it's hidden, it's revealed. Well, that's the language of modernism, really. That's what Glissant liked about William Faulkner's work. Glissant said about William Faulkner to African American, he said, I know you don't like this writer because he's racist, and you are right. But you need to read this writer because he's the first American writer. I think maybe Mark Twain was there too. The first American writer who has shown that America is a bastardized, creolized country that needs to be celebrated. We have to celebrate creolization, bastardization. And Faulkner was the first, even though he was denying it, even though he was saying, white people stay here, Indians stay here, blacks stay here, his whole work is revealing how it was impossible to do. And Glissant is telling people, if you read Faulkner, you see that. So this is what these writers are teaching me today. They're not afraid to do that. They're not, I mean, these writers, these painters and filmmakers, you all are teaching me. You're not only telling me what I want to hear because I was trained in black studies, and in black studies, this is what we do. I always tell people, Fanon taught me how to think, but Glissant saved my life. There is a big difference between those two things. You know, one thought, my thinking is dialectical, but Glissant comes and just threw dialectics in the water. Said, this is nothing, get away from this. So I think that's what these two artists are doing that I like. You know, I'm gonna be 70 years, suddenly I have become rejuvenated because I can see in their work, they're not just talking about themselves, they're not just talking about just their origins, and they are, but they are in order to change the world, not just to change themselves or to teach you to recognize them. That's what I like here, yeah.
Thank you. And I was also thinking about when you talked the être étant, Glissant talked about the unpredictable way of becoming, no?
Yes, absolutely, yes.
And it also, I wanted to come back and before we then look at Michael's slides, maybe another question also for Ellen about opacity, because we often, I mean, both Manthia and I discussed with Glissant the notions of opacity, and he often told me that to understand means to possess, right? And he basically says...
Exactly, you own it. You
exactly,
understand.
And
I didn't hear that, sorry.
To understand means to possess. And if I'm becoming, you never know who I am, right? That's right. How you explained it in your beautiful text.
Yeah.
And that means not to own the other.
Right.
And Glissant's opacity in that sense is a lack of transparency. It's an untranslatability. It's you call it unknowability.
Right. Well, because I don't know how to translate all the time, so I'm sorry, yes.
No, but it's beautiful. It's untranslatability and unknowability. So opacity in that sense has the radical potentiality for social movements to challenge and actually subvert systems of dominations like Glissant. So I was very curious, Ellen, about the black paintings and opacity.
I think about opacity alongside of also ideas of, you know, amnesia and memory, and also, you know, dormancy in a way. I mean, if you think of back to Black Girl, if you think of the sculpture that becomes dormant in that apartment when they hang it on the white wall, and it's that moment when that that as Sembène says, you know, I could have ended the film when she dies.
That's right.
And I didn't, because I wanted that mythological moment when that mask is alive again. That child puts on the mask when her employer comes to bring her wages to her family and return her suitcase, and that mask is there. And, you know, her family doesn't accept the wage, or, you know, they can't accept, you know, and he's frightened and baffled, you know, it's this, you know, and that's not the same thing as a kind of, as this becoming or this amnesia, because that's where Sembène leaves us.
Yes.
Is this moment where the boy is kind of dancing with that mask on, and that mask has come to life again.
They come to life.
And I'm just showing two last paintings where, you know, I also have this relationship looking at quite often Fang masks or sculptures and that live behind glass in museums. And what does that mean? You know, they are, in some ways, it's not that they are dead, but they are dormant, I think. And I was thinking of, you know, in this recent work, you know, what could it be if they could be retrieved in a way through like culture, as, you know, when that boy puts it on through mythology, that they are, in a way, they become alive again. And as if, you know, you are, you know, bringing up, you know, it could be a water sample, or you're bringing up, resurfacing something from the seabed that is not the bodies of the Middle Passage, because that's, you know, that loss, that's irretrievable, right?
Yeah.
The human loss is irretrievable. But there is a kind of cultural, there's something that's insoluble and inscrutable that is, you know, that can be awakened, and you know, I think.
And can you tell us more about this very recent work? Is this a new series? Because it connects to the Whitney Biennial.
They are in. Yeah. They're up now. Yeah, in the Whitney Biennial, curated by David Breslin and Adrian Edwards, and it was just incredible during this time to be, again, in a way they are about having that that continuum, that conversation. And you sort of, you know, we all got a bit isolated, right, in this time. And I didn't, maybe not you, Hans, but I, you know, I was in my studio, you know, and that feeling of, you know, those relationships, or just being able to imagine those connections between people, that seemed to me like suddenly very real. And it was still very intuitive, you know, because I wasn't really sharing exactly what I was making, but they are based on these sculptures I'm looking at, these Fang sculptures that I've been looking at since I was in New York. And they are rituals, right? They are functional ritual sculptures, but when you see them at the Met, when you see them in these museums, it's not, of course, I'm still appreciating to see them, but there's a dormancy, I think. It's a different thing. You're looking at them through this glassy distance. And what does it mean in this moment now, this resurfacing? That is actually the time span then, that is, so they're kind of like surrounded by these wormholes, you know, the Osidex again coming into it. So this idea of resurfacing this fossilized network that can become alive like a mask.
Sure.
Thank you. And there are so many segues now to Michael, because, of course, the exhibition, Michael, at the Kunsthalle, titled You Who Are Still Alive, is very connected to what Ellen just described, these last years of more solitude in the studio and many lockdowns. The entire exhibition, more or less, was created over the last 2 years. And I remember when I came to the studio, actually, in terms of the Sembène Goya project, I saw the beginning of these paintings, and then I saw them in a more advanced state the second time. And I will never forget that moment when I came into the studio, and literally every single painting had the eyes closed. There was a room full of painting with closed eyes. And there is actually a text, Ellen, in your book, which at the end here of the chapter of the black paintings, which goes, "Our eyes are closed."
By Elvin Zabunyan.
Exactly, it's very beautiful. Our eyes are closed. We see glimmers through our shut eyelids. Shadows, sometimes red-tinted, pass. We remain in the silence. We look at the night. We reflect. We feel the eyeballs, we open our eyes, we're in darkness, we continue to see the glimmer, we plunge into darkness. Can you tell us about you who are still alive?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll pop up a painting from there. Yeah, like you said, it was kind of made between lockdowns in London and Nairobi. And it actually really gave me an opportunity to, being stuck in both places, to really engage in a way in ideas of landscape that I hadn't previously been able to, from moving around and not having enough time in Kenya. But just to kind of take it back a little, to Sambene once again, who the film Kala is the kind of one of the origins of this painting. And there's a scene, or there are many, but one of the narratives in the film is of the, all the disabled people on the streets are rounded up and then kicked out of the city. Yeah. They then have this for me, one of the most powerful scenes I've ever seen in film, where they all come through the sand dunes on the edge of the city. Some carrying others who can't walk, others are crawling through the sand, and they slowly, through many different scenes, through the sort of second half of the film, make their way back to the political figure who was mentioned earlier, back to his house. And then they have this kind of, they start spitting on him, and he has his comeuppance, basically. Although it's not the same, there was a moment where in Nairobi they cleared out all the street children very briefly and sent them to children's homes. And now back on the streets, both disabled people and the kids are there. And I was thinking about kind of urban bucolic scenes, in particular rubbish dumps. And there's a massive area called Dandora on the in the suburbs, in the eastern suburbs of Nairobi. And the rubbish is so high, it looks like mountains. And you have all the pigs, kind of ruffling through, and as if, again, they're in a vast sort of farming landscape. And the same with the people. A lot of them are street kids who are sort of harvesting scrap metal, bits of plastic, anything to be recycled and make their living. And I kind of wanted to pay respect to the scene in Kala and I took some of the figures of the musicians are from that film. They're slightly altered, but yeah, really that was the heart of this painting. And there's something I feel that's very similar to how you were talking about the way the sort of overpass, which totally obliterated a community, but then is kind of repurposed and brought back in as this echo chamber for singing, which is so beautiful. I mean, yeah, there's something about how culture will find a way to make use of these kind of void spaces that felt familiar to this, And then, yeah, just on the landscape point, and again, back to Sambene, for me, one of the other important things, and again, what you were saying earlier about how he wanted to work in moving images to put people back on screen. That was exactly, hearing him talk about that was actually one of the things that made me return to figurative painting and realize, also thinking about Ngugi wa Thiong'o talking about writing in your mother tongue. It became very important for me to have figures and stories that were from home, and especially of people that really are very often, their stories wouldn't be told and they would be marginalized. And this painting was based on Ngugi wa Thiong'o's telling of the Perfect Nine. And this is the 10th daughter of the Perfect Nine, called Warigia, who's the most exceptional of all the 10 daughters. And again, given that it's a very old sort of origin myth of the Kikuyu, for me it was interesting that even though she was the 10th, she's not even mentioned in the title, it's actually very similar to the visibility of people with disabilities at home. You know, that they're there, but they're not you know, present unless they're on the streets. And so I really wanted to do a painting which was situated in like a real location at home. And so I started doing these paintings en plein air, kind of old school.
So the whole show was painted plein air?
Yeah, half of it. Yeah. Half of it was. Yeah, those were the Kenya lockdowns. Yeah. Yeah, but that's kind of, yeah, that's a little bit of what's there. But
and can you tell us about the title, You Who Are Still Alive, and also maybe about the first painting One Encounters? Actually, you were thinking for a long time about maybe having a bigger painting, but then made the decision to have this amazing painting of the resistance fighter Koyatel, the head of Koyatel.
Yeah.
Basically, it would be great to hear about the title and the entry through this painting.
Yeah, again, uncanny with what you were saying as well, where Koyatel was a leader of the Kalenjins, one of the main leaders who fought against the colonials, and his resistance was so strong that they ended up bringing in someone who was very notorious, the colonials that is, brought in someone who was very notoriously brutal, and he arranged a peace treaty where both sides met in an open field, so the story goes. Koyatel and this guy shook hands, agreed peace. Koyatel turned around and then he shot him in the back and decapitated him, and took his head as a trophy of this victory back to London. And that was also the end of the Kalenjin resistance as well. And so I was in a conference about repatriating objects back to the continent, and the museum director of the museum in Kenya had said, if anyone knows where Koyatel's head is, please can you send it back? And we're also looking for the man-eaters of Savo. So he was, you know, so yeah, so I thought I'd paint it, send it back, you know.
And the title, You Who Are Still Alive, is also a painting in the show.
Yeah.
And it would be great to hear about that, because that has to do with these many paintings with closed eyes.
Yeah, the kind of center of the show was an idea of, like you're saying, of walking into a room of people with closed eyes. I'm not really sure why, but that piece would have been lovely to steal. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of the beginning. And so in the show, there's a dark room, thinking about exactly the sensations described in that text, where all the figures in the room have their eyes shut, one of which is a figure who's kind of between states, called You Who Are Still Alive. I got that right? It's called Akul. And yeah, I stole that from a little passage in Ocean Vuong's novel. I'm not going to massacre his title trying to remember it, but does anyone know that incredible book by Ocean Vuong? There we go. Thank you, Anna. Yeah. We're on Earth, we're briefly gorgeous. Yeah. Yeah, and there's a passage. It just felt, I don't know why that, but it spoke to me and it felt right. Yeah.
Thank you. And Manthia, you are so close to Ngugi.
Right.
So I was thinking maybe you could.
Oh, it's amazing, the two paintings that Michael shared, the one with Kala and then Ngugi. First, I want to say something about landscape, because he said it mentioned landscape a few times. And landscape in Glissant, and for many Caribbean writers, you know, Aimé Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, landscape is a character in a way. And Glissant liked to say that transparency is the country of someone without landscape. Glissant used to oppose that all the time, because landscape was the most, in a way, not only environmental voice, but a way of connecting you to the land, but also to feel, we were talking about trembling, to feel the trembling of the land, because land spoke and you spoke, and your relation, your solidarity with the land is very important in this sense. So the first painting with the griot playing the ngoni, and this incredible color scene, which is a little bit like Antoine Artaud, but it's the theater of cruelty and all these things. It's really, definitely in African cinema, it's the worst moment. You know, you can't watch it because they literally, in order to cure this El Hajj, his name is El Hajj, meaning somebody who has been to Makkah, but he's now the new bourgeoisie, he's mistreating people. So to cure him, all these beggars have to come one by one and spit on him. I mean, it's a scene that you have to see, really. It's really, then to have Michael purpose that. And you know, Glissant always said that knowledge travels, and it gets bigger by travel from place to place. And what Ellen and Michael, what they do for me is that they take a knowledge from Goya, from the Greek, or from Samben, and they make it speak to Tremaine in New Orleans, or to Kenya in Nairobi. So something that has already been treated in another, that kind of intertextuality is really priceless. Because it means that you're not locking yourself into your box and saying that your case is special. Your case actually is getting bigger with the knowledge of other cases that relate to your case. Mm-hmm. My suffering is now worse than your suffering. So why should I say the way I suffer is the worst? So to have color speak to the situation in Kenya is beautiful. What is important about Ngugi, for the young generation who have not encountered Ngugi's work, Ngugi, again, like Samben, Ngugi in the English-speaking world was like in the third biggest, best writer with Soyinka, Achebe, and Ngugi. They named them like that. He wrote books in English like Weep Not Child, Grain of Wheat, Petals of Blood. And then one day decided that he would write in Kikuyu. He just made a radical decision to write in his mother tongue. But Ngugi is especially known because people use today the word post-colonialism and decolonial and all this. In 1971, he left Leeds, went back to Nairobi and became a lecturer. And he organized other groups and told them, from now on, let's abolish the English department. Let's put in the center of study African literature, Caribbean literature, Asian literature, and some English around. I don't mean don't read Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is no longer going to be in the center of literature. Now, when you hear today the subaltern people, Homi Baba, Gayatri, it started with Ngugi in 1970. He spent 1 year in prison for doing this. Because they arrested him, put him in jail for 1 year. But post-colonialism really started with Ngugi. You know, all the scholars will tell you that. So, and then he began to write in Kikuyu, encourage people to write in African languages. And when democracy that you talk so well about arrived in Kenya, he asked me, could you come with me and film me, because I'm going home after so many years of exile. And of course, that turned into a disaster because he was attacked by the police, not the police, but by a group that they call the Mukuyu. This is a breakaway from the not the Kikuyu,
Mungiki guys.
Mungiki guys. Yeah, and they basically come and say, are you Munguki or Kuku? And then it was very violent. You have to read about it. And to begin to go from this painting to bring that back is really what is priceless. You know, because coming from Africa, we always want to show how well we know Baudelaire. When I left high school to go to America, you know, I wanted to prove to people that I knew my Mallarmé by heart, my Rimbaud by heart. But meanwhile, I had turned my back on everything in Africa. But how do I use something in Africa to teach the West? but without rejecting the West, use something in the West to teach in Africa. You know, Glissant's famous statement, and this is really what, I stopped. He said, the West is not a geography. The West is a project. And that's why people are in the so-called West geography are upset, because people outside of the West are using Western enlightenment, modernity, human right to criticize the West. They can't take that. So, because the West is a project, it doesn't belong to anybody. Islam is a project, Christianity is a project. The West also is a project. Glissant said this, the West is a project. When are we going to understand that? That it doesn't belong to France, it doesn't belong to Switzerland, it doesn't belong to Germany, it's a project. This was very important to Glissant.
It's a very important point, and also I was actually thinking of Glissant in Michael's show, what you just said, this idea, because you described Glissant, Manthia, as an activist of the natural surroundings, where the landscape is a character, where the sea is a character. Exactly. I think that's also true for you, Ellen, no? Thinking about your films. Yeah. But then also Ngugi, I mean, I think we should have a campaign, actually, that Ngugi gets the Nobel Prize for Literature, because I think it's kind of relatively urgent.
Every year he's shortlisted, third, fourth, first.
Exactly, and it's time for him to get it, so we should make some form of petition. And what is interesting is, you know, I spent a week with him in Manchester and with Adam Thurl at the Studio Creole, and wanted him to bring together with Michael, but the diaries didn't work, so we had to do this next time. And once we spent a week there, you know, we talked a lot about the necessity also for more bridges between art and literature. And I think that's so fascinating, because that's, Michael spoke about Ngugi in relation to his painting, but Ellen, for you also literature plays such an enormous role since the beginning, and we just spoke before about you going to interview Octavia Butler. Can you talk a little bit about how literature connects to your work?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a different terrain now, because now it's a given that these things are wound together. And I remember that was, you know, maybe a critique in the work, that there was a kind of literary dimension, but it was also because I was wanting to be in that language, in you know, that continuum of Octavia Butler. And I you know, really realize now, because so many, you know, young people that I meet are referencing Octavia Butler really as, you know, really, and that it's really part of the way they conceive the art world is through her and her idea of continuum, which is maybe a little different from Glissant, I don't know, because it is very grim. Yeah. You know, her continuum is really, you know, that concrete centipede has really joined to you, and what you will become, that thing is staying, and you will need to learn how to make your community with that. So you know, she herself struggled with, in some ways, the grimness in her work, but she never gave up. I mean, her last novel is Fledgling, is a vampire novel in a way. So it's even, you know, that is also about the undead, right? That's right. And continuity. And but I feel that I'm returning to her again and again, her voice, and we miss that she's not here with us.
And we have a kind of a segue to literature now, because we have some images actually of Glissant.
They're making a signal to you there.
Yeah, I know. Good. So on the one hand, we have here Glissant's drawings, where we have the tourbillon, because obviously Glissant also wanted to start and did start his own institute, the All World Institute, and we're going to have a question at the end, actually to Michael, of course, about your institute in Nairobi, which just opened. Glissant had the All World Institute, and here we have this idea of the archipelago, no? Which came up a lot in the conversation. The archipelago is a passage and not a wall. And so here is Glissant. But before I have final questions for the three of you, it would be great, Manthia, to hear a little bit about your new project, because you're doing a film for Back to Earth. It's the environment, actually, Edouard Glissant and the Poetics of Solidarity. And you moved, actually, for this very reason, to Senegal, and you're working on a film. So it would be great to hear briefly a little bit about this film and the way you produce reality with that.
Well, the film is a video diary, but it's more, now we have fixed the title. It's called A Letter from Yen. I'm sending a letter to Serpentine that commissioned the film. And Letter from Yen is me buying a house, quick summary, by the ocean, and then the ocean coming to attack the house, and how that changed me into an environmentalist. And the first thing that I noticed would be men fishing, so the fishing and how the fish has become rare, and women who used to be fishmongers, they now collect pebbles to build houses, and immigrants like myself use the pebbles to build our houses, so supposedly to protect them against the environment. So the story in the film is well, one woman told me, I've heard this from white people. If you want me to stop collecting pebbles, give me money. So, and then the fisherman said, no, that's an easy answer. How can we all get together and begin to change our rapport to the environment? So the film became a critique of myself, because as a Westerner, which I am, I go to Africa, and a sign of my success is to buy a house by the ocean. That's the Western dream. So I have a house right on the ocean, and so what is my role in the destruction of the environment? So how can I begin to even have a real conversation with the people I'm supposedly filming to sell to the West? Here is what they're doing. We try to teach them. So how do I change that discourse to a critique of myself? And then in myself, you and them and everyone else. That's what I do. I try to do. And again, very much inspired by Edouard Glissant.
Thank you. And I know that we are out of time. I think there are so many interesting connections here. We need to continue this soon with the second chapter, because of course also when we think about landscapes as a character and what you've just been talking about, the aesthetics of solidarity in relation to the film, is also made me think also of Osedax, your other film project with Edgar, which is in the exhibition actually of Ellen and Edgar in Spain, which is an ecosystem of diversity in some way. Now, last questions, just before we then open it up, maybe for a few questions. My last questions to you are the two kind of only questions I always ask, the kind of recurrent question. There's the one about the unrealized project. We've heard such wonderful things from the three of you about projects you have realized and are about to realize. It would be great to hear a little bit about your unrealized projects, maybe projects which have been too big to be realized or too expensive or too time intense. Censorship could be a reason for unrealized. Or as Doris Lessing always told me, there is also projects one wants to do but hasn't dared to do yet. Doris called this self-censorship. So there's a big range or scope of unrealized projects. It would be great to hear from the three of you about one of your favorite unrealized projects. Maybe we start with Ellen.
Yeah, I really feel like the films remain unrealized. In that sense, maybe they're part of the continuum. That would be the more positive way to look at it. But there is something where they feel like they could always happen again and change, and that there is some sort of disappointment in a sense, or that it didn't, I don't know. There is something unrealized about, and I don't know if it's the process of making films or the way that I would make them or the world of filmmaking, but there's something unrealized about that aspect of my work.
Thank you. Michael?
It's probably the library at NCAI, the Nairobi Contemporary Arts Institute. Trying to do a library is remarkably difficult. So it's bringing together enough books.
But we can help with that. I think everybody here should send you books, right?
Yeah, fantastic.
So you should all send books to Nairobi, to Michael's library.
Yeah.
But can you tell us about because the Institute is, so it's partially unrealized, because the Institute is actually realized The library is not yet realized. It would be the moment maybe to talk about the institute.
Yeah, we got the infrastructure. We just don't have the thing that matters, the books. We opened in 2020 in January, and it's called Nairobi Contemporary Arts Institute. The kind of remit is basically for the growth and preservation of contemporary art in the region. And we opened with a show of an extraordinary artist called Sain Wadu. He kind of came to prominence in the 80s and 90s, and is one of that generation who are still working and quite prolifically today. The other aspect of NCAI is educational, where in October we're hoping to start a postgraduate program. With that, we hope it'll provide something different to what you already get on the ground. So we're hoping it'll have a bit of an international reach and exposure for the artists that will be part of that. Yeah, but at the moment, if anyone's ever in Nairobi, please go check out NCAI.
Thank you, Manthia.
Yeah, I know I've responded to this question several times, and the answer is always different. Okay, because now what is haunting me, in this place, I'm from Mali, and I live in Senegal by the ocean. And I have become really close to the fishermen and the women who no longer smoke fish but collect pebbles. But we say bonjour, bonjour. But in the bonjour, we communicate a lot. And I'm now wondering, would I be able, what is the solution? Should I learn Wolof? Can I learn Wolof at my age? Or are we communicating enough by shaking our heads, by doing things, by saying hello, by waving, body language, and so on? So how do I improve my communication with the people in the village? Even though I went to the village in the first place as a Westerner, in order not to communicate. I could have gone to a Soninke village, my ethnic group, or a Bambara village, or Fulani, I'm closer, or more. These are the languages I can feel and know. But I mean, with Wolofs, and I don't understand the language, we just say bonjour, nangadef. So how do I communicate? Or what is communication? Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering about this.
Great to end the panel on a question. Very last question, just quick answers, your advice to a young artist. Many young artists are here. It would be great to hear your advice to a young artist. Ellen?
Well, we were talking so much about mentors, and I just would say that what I've seen is that you are each other's electric current. And I think the mentor thing is super important. But there is something right now that you have together, and I've said this before to some of you, and it's I don't know if they really believe me, but it's really electric, and it's really something to try to take with you forward. This, not just each other, but where you are right now, what you're doing together, that kind of currency you have between each other, that is the thing you need to keep and figure out how to travel that with you.
Thank you, Michael.
I'll say I don't know how qualified I am to give advice, but I think I'm gonna, like, this is a bit of a cop out and second that, just simply because I feel like the people that I studied with, the handful of people around me have been the most extraordinary support through both difficult and good times, and I think to recognize that and appreciate that of your colleagues and people you're with is kind of special.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Manthia.
Yeah, the most important thing for me, I'm a student of comparative literature. The most important thing was studying movements, literary movements, futurism, acmeism, surrealism. This was the most enlightening. So I would advise students to not just close themselves in, which artists do, to get together, form movements, It doesn't have to be political. It could be anything. Form movements of something. Get together, talk to each other, share your work. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Now I'm told that we really have to stop, but we are all here, so if there are questions, we can answer them informally. And to conclude, I wanted to quote Manthia, a Baroque of Voices, demeurer et être ailleurs. Thank you so, so much, Ellen, Michael, Manthia. A big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.